Next speaker is John Souter from LINX. When we tour the country with UKNOF, we try and do what we can to help facilitate local infrastructure development. LINX is very much involved in developing local infrastructure in the form of internet exchanges, and John wants to talk about LINX's strategy that they have put together for regional peering.
Thanks, Keith. Follow that, as they say. I was sitting watching Brandon's presentation thinking that what I'm going to talk about is proceeding at a very pedestrian pace in comparison with this kind of, let's see if it's ready by 7 o'clock for live transmission at 9. That does seem like an amazing amount of brinkmanship. Who's heard me talk about this before? Let me just gauge the room. Few. Okay. Well, it's good that there are some new listeners anyway. I was rather tempted by the circumstances to offer a quick prayer first, or maybe even a sermon. I've decided I'm just going to preach about one thing, though. As usual, I picked up my badge and stuck it on in the way that Dinesh gave it to me. And of course, what immediately happens is it turns around so that no one can see who you are. We've all got these stupid things in the middle, and you actually can just put 2 tags on it, and then your badge stays the same way around. If you're involved in conference organisation, I really, just for the life of me, can't imagine why we don't just do that simply. Anyway, preaching over. Yes, hold on, everyone. Right, so the abstract to this was to talk a little bit about our regional peering programme and ultimately to try and make it relevant to Northern Ireland. I was here a year ago trying to stir things up, and I'll try and come back to that at the end. I'm going to try and go fairly quickly so that there's time to answer questions, and particularly if I do manage to stir anyone up in Belfast, their comments and contributions would be welcome. I'm going to make 2 assumptions. I'm going to assume, because I'm not going to tell you about it, that you know all about peering and internet exchanges. I think if you've come to a UKNOF and you don't, it would be a bit odd. And I'm also going to assume that perhaps you understand the benefits that accrue from these. So I'm not attempting to sell anything to you in any sense. So I also thought you don't want to hear me drone on about LINX, so I try and get LINX into one slide. Pretty tricky thing to do these days because we seem to have grown a bit in recent times. So you should all know that we're a mutual. I'm very proud of the fact. Over the years, we've evolved and clarified that we actually have a dual mission. I personally maintain that it's pretty tricky these days, especially if you're an internet exchange of our size, to not be involved in trying to mitigate the stupid activities of governments, whilst at the same time trying to provide a peering platform, because they try to meddle all the time. If they're not meddling in our interests, they're meddling in our members' interests, and sometimes it's all just indistinguishable. We've been around for 20 years. I didn't want to make a big deal of it today, but it is in fact our 20th birthday year, so hooray to us. We're about 50 staff now, and we're supporting 5 current peering lands, soon to be 6, on 2 continents, because we've opened an exchange in North America. And you can see about something in the order of 550 ASNs connecting from something like 60 countries. So it's come a long way from the original mission of keeping traffic local in the UK. And I don't want to bore you with traffic statistics. Now, I've shown this slide a few times. I'm not sure whether people actually believe me or not, but I really did have one of those epiphany moments where you have that kind of flash of inspiration that you just really haven't put together before. And the epiphany came from the fact that, my job and what we and LINX are supposed to be doing is keeping traffic local. I think from a UK versus the world perspective, we've actually done that pretty successfully. The horror stories of what people had to do before there was a way of exchanging traffic in London were pretty terrible. And they're in fact just straightforward barriers to entry. You couldn't be an ISP very easily because it was just too darned expensive to get properly into the game. You could maybe, around the edges, and people are very creative, do something, but if you wanted to offer a full service, then it was pretty tricky without transatlantic bandwidth, and that just came at a massive price. And The LINX grew because the industry wanted it to. LINX grew because the members themselves made it happen. We went through quite a few years when LINX was based on a volunteer workforce, and in the days in which Keith fostered it and grew it. But all of that just helped do something that was already true of the UK, which was to make the UK very horribly London-centric. In a way, we just perpetuated a trend that was sort of already there. And so that epiphany came from the rather privileged position I had of being able to look at what goes on in other European countries and compare and contrast them with the UK, and to think, hey, it's weird that there are lots of regional peering initiatives around Europe, and we just simply don't seem to have them in the UK. And at that time, with the honourable exception of IX Leeds and some strange things that were going on in Manchester, there was pretty much no public peering facility outside of London in the UK. So the epiphany point, I suppose, was, can we keep traffic more local? Because as the volume of traffic increases and people's dependence upon efficiency in the internet increases, that drive to keep traffic more local is sort of inevitably there. And what I came to realize was that maybe we were actually part of the problem. Maybe by developing such a large exchange in London, and the only other large exchange in the UK was also in London, that actually inhibited any prospect of public peering happening outside of it. And of course there was pain in Manchester because there had been a viable internet exchange, Manap in Manchester, and there's a sort of sad tale of what happened to it. So what I did first was to say, well, actually we have the capability to do something about this, and therefore maybe it's our duty. So the first test is that what members thought? It's no good just having a good idea from the centre and no one buying into it. So I spent quite a bit of effort getting around with people and seeing whether there really was support for an initiative of this kind. And I was actually rather amazed by the reaction, because I thought I was going to get pushback. I thought particularly I was going to get pushback from the board on behalf of the members, who would ask all the pragmatic questions like, where's the money going to come from, and are you sure? And there's a million variants of how those sorts of questions can be posed. And they didn't. They were very encouraging and said, let's look at ways in which we can really make this happen. And then if we've got a credible story to tell, then maybe there'll be more buy-in, as we talk to more people about it. I got out and talked to the members and to see what they said, and again was really rather surprised at their reaction. I got everything in the range of about time and please can we do this first in Manchester, and can I pay money for this, and it was quite astonishing how supportive people were. Now, this slide makes it look very simple, but it took me quite a while to actually get this written down coherently. I found that it went from being a bit of a jumble in my mind to various levels of greater coherence. You'll have to judge for yourself whether you think that document is coherent. I made the interesting decision to let lots of people help me write that document, and then realized at one point that there were such a variety of styles in there that it didn't read very well. So it was a bit of a labor of love to get it out. And then, it's no use publishing documents. We actually got out and did some practical things. I guess the somewhat scariest thing we did in this process was that the Manchester folk begged us to actually try and get the Manchester Exchange going before the Olympics. Now, we were a bit distracted at the time. Again, probably quite a lot of you have heard me talk about this, but I don't think LINX has ever been busier in its history in the months leading up to the London Olympics, and yet somehow, crazily, we managed to get another internet exchange built at the same time. A big learning experience, because the exchange in London was quite a complicated beast. It had notions of mothership and so on that when we built an isolated exchange in Manchester, there was no mothership to report to, and I guess nearly all of our software needed looking at again, because we just got a wrong perspective on it. But all grist to the mill. That one opened in June, July in 2012. We opened IX Scotland in 2013, and we're going to open IX Cardiff in 2014. So that's what we've done in practical terms about this. When I built that slide, I thought to myself, Is that really a set of achievements to be proud of? Actually, it was quite hard work to get that far, and I'll try and illustrate that. So really quickly, I'll dip through these slides. The concept was to use the existing LINX membership structure, so not to create new organizations, not to create new bureaucratic barriers, to keep it nice and simple. The key was respecting the local ownership need, reflect back on, why did LINX get to where it is? It got to where it is because of the membership. So you need some way of replicating that within the membership organization. A key thing you can do, which I think has scuppered other initiatives, is you can take a long-term view. If you have to race to some notion of viability and you don't get there and everyone feels miserable, then perhaps you've done worse than not even trying at all. And another key aspect was the architectural one of these are standalone exchanges. LINX itself becomes a carrier if we were to link the regional exchanges back to London. There is actually a bunch of controversy still about that, but we can go into that in questions if anyone wants to. The services are just going to be exactly what you get from London, and then you start to realise that there's economy of scale that can be delivered because you can support these things with the existing staff base that you've built. And then you can do some clever things with pricing too. You can actually encourage people to come peering who perhaps have never done it, and we've been moderately successful, I think, with that. You can establish honeymoon periods where you don't charge, in order that people who are struggling to justify these new connections can feel, okay, well, I can do that without having to pay commercial charges for it. And then it keeps coming back to this point about viability, and I think there are two aspects to that, certainly what I feel I've learned along the way. One is that you've got to try and take the long view and not just to hope that things can come to some magical state really quickly. And you're only really going to do that if you've got buy-in from a local community who cares about it. If you can't find a local community that cares about it, then you're pretty much uphill. Parenthetically, one needs to say you need the support of local data centres, and if you haven't got that, you've just got yet another big hurdle in the process. But as we're seeing with Cardiff, that there may be ways around that, or maybe ways of at least bridging around that, because I think it is more strictly bridging than dealing with it any other way. I've gone backwards, sorry. The document, that's the front cover of the document that I published. The URL was a few slides back. If you actually want to read more detail than I'm giving today, then please take a look in there. I think another interesting thing that started to happen along the way was we started to see this become more of a strategic thing. There's no getting around the fact that people had engineered their networks to be London-centric. And if you've engineered your London network to be London-centric and it involves a lot of money, then suddenly asking them to break out bits of the network so that you can peer it locally is tough. It's not going to happen straight away. And even if those larger networks commit to what you're doing, you might have to take a deep breath and wait a while before it catches up. And you've also got to think about the processes they're going through. If they're having to buy large routers and there's big capital expenditure involved and usually big bureaucracy and justification involved, then that isn't going to happen overnight. You've got to help. You've got to actually link yourself in some way to that process that's going on. And I think we're in the phase at the moment where that's beginning to happen. It's fair to say, though, that the large content providers are always going to be behind you. Large content providers always like internet exchanges. Frankly, they would have had to invent us if we hadn't been already there when large content providers began to show themselves in the form of the first CDNs and subsequently what the large media companies have done. So I think I've made that point. So I'm going to quickly say what's happening with the three exchanges, and then I'll try and come back to Belfast. So in Manchester, it really was a return to peering. ManApp had never got to a massive size, and I think it's fair to say that IX Manchester now is quite a bit bigger than ManApp ever was. But frankly, I think we're still in early days. We're only 2 years into the life of the exchange. We've already grown to 50 ASNs. At present, we're only in the Telecity Williams Kilburn cluster. I have to say Telecity have been very, very supportive. I mean, people have mixed views about Telecity, but actually they could not have been more supportive to us with this venture, and we're going to link up their newest data centre, Jewel House, shortly, as well as M247's data centre. And there was a tale of woe that I think people were alluding to there about dealing with certain fibre suppliers in the city, but I'll skip over that. Some of the larger networks are now present, so Akamai joined within the last week. And I think that at last we're going to see sufficient content being presented to meet the aspirations of what is largely an access community that's currently connected at IX Manchester. Scotland's been a bit odd. We had the advantage of a dominant data centre there. A survey showed that something like 50% of the existing carrier-neutral data centre space in Scotland was actually in one place in Paulson's, what was the old Scholar Cape, Paulson's South Kyle. And on the back of that, it seemed so racingly obvious that we should start the exchange there. But it's actually taken off a lot more slowly than we expected. And we're in a mode now, so that the local steering committee is really trying to grasp this and say, okay, what can we do to increase the speed of takeoff? There are only 11 ASNs connected today, but I'm sure I'll look at that in the future and not be at all apologetic that this sort of slow start happened. And as you can see from the slide, the vision of the local steering committee is to try to get to 50 networks and at least 50 gig of peak traffic within 5 years. I think that's completely realisable, and we may look back and laugh at those numbers at some point in the future. And then the real surprise, we ran a consultation exercise in Cardiff in almost exactly a year ago, and as you would predict, there was a great deal of local enthusiasm, but what we seemed to encounter were what all the obstacles were, all the reasons why this couldn't happen. Principally, a complete lack of carrier-neutral data centres, certainly in Cardiff itself. The local steering committee drove that forward. I think it's fair to say that if it hadn't been for their enthusiasm and their doggedness and their willingness to try and tackle the issues, and a really unique combination of both private industry, local government, and the Welsh government, that group that somehow welded themselves together and forged that forward, they really made it happen. And what we're doing to get around the carrier-neutral bit is we're effectively providing a carrier-neutral zone within the BT data centre. BT don't want to be providing a host to an internet exchange, but they're willing to allow it, within this encapsulated zone. And we're just at the final stages of that. Things are being built. There'll be facilities to show off very, very shortly, and we're looking at a launch in October. I've skipped over a multitude of sins that I could have probably warbled on about for ages about that, but I'll try and get to the nub of it now. As I said, we've already done a number of other consultations. There was a good bit of enthusiasm in Birmingham, and if you think about the demographics of the UK, there's something like 10 million people live in the West Midlands, and it's comparatively speaking one of the wealthy areas of the country. It seems bizarre that you couldn't make an internet exchange viable in such a local community when you see what's being done in much smaller groups, much smaller countries around Europe. I'm reasonably confident that we'll be able to get something started in Birmingham next year, but there's still a lot to do. The big plus that's coming is that the local data centre scene is at last developing. As I said, we did one in Belfast. And that brings me to the point of this slide, which is we may be a bit ahead of the curve with all of this. And I've been reflecting a lot on that. Is it right that we're a bit ahead of the curve? Is that the right thing for us to be doing? I think the answer is clear. If our members want us to do that, then yes. And I think it isn't a crime to be slightly ahead of the curve, because if there's an inevitability to all this, then being ready and actually starting to work out all these infrastructure issues is the thing to do. So, come to Belfast. It actually suffers the same disadvantages as Cardiff. There are data centres being talked about both in the city and on the periphery. There's the same things being talked about in terms of cable landing points and all that. I won't go over it. But of course, in terms of its comparison with Wales to the rest of the UK, there is this inconvenient bit of water in the way too. And of course, the lure of data centres in Dublin, where there is a considerable cluster of them. So I think our Cardiff experience shows that it is possible, and I think maybe some of the negative thoughts that were generated a year ago can be overcome. But I think the big if is the local community needs to want it. If there isn't a group of people here who are willing to slog through and help us overcome those issues, then even with the resources that we can bring to the party, it's still going to be pretty difficult. So I guess this is a call to arms to local people. If you think, based on what you've seen and heard in this brief talk, that we can do something in Belfast, we've certainly made provision in our budgets and planning for next year to be able to do it if the local community is here to help steer it through. There's a bunch of URLs there for people who would like to pursue any of the details that I've talked about, and I'll happily now answer any questions. Or you could just make a comment if you want to.
Hi, it's David Freeman here from Clarinet. Have you investigated the prevalence of private peering relationships between organisations in region, perhaps, confidentially?
Yes. The trouble is it's tough to talk about in public, Dave. I think when any of the consultations happen that we've run to a bit of a formula, and it is always the same. Let's try and understand what people are doing already and where they're doing it, and then if there's something there that could be built on and made more efficient for those people already playing, then all to the good. And in effect, what happened in Manchester was exactly that model.
Okay, thank you.
I'm damaging your format slightly, but I remember at the IX Manchester launch, Dave spoke quite interestingly, very interestingly, about the difficulties of re-engineering and network engineering. Certainly interested if you've had any sense of that from access network providers you've spoken to, and just wondered again what Dave's thoughts were 2 years on.
I'll just follow up. I'll remind people in the room of the question I think I asked at the IX Manchester launch event, which was that what was the attention paid to peering up access and content networks. Big problem has been it's quite easy if you're a content provider. All you do is basically throw your content out as close as possible to where it comes from. If you're an access provider, you want to attract that traffic back to your access users where they actually live, you've got a bit more of a problem because there's no kind of common signalling that takes place between the two networks. Even though we have many different technical means, it always seems to break down to people de-aggregating and announcing de-aggregates in order to try and engineer the traffic in place. I mentioned the fact that this behaviour wasn't really standardised. I asked the question as to whether it's still even relevant, because what's happening. I see a lot now of people taking 2 years later, people taking content delivery network nodes on board the network to try and offload the content to the access, and then when they get frustrated with the fact that the content delivery nodes don't exactly offload the traffic where they want it to, they try and fool the content delivery nodes by doing the same kind of things that they would do on a public network, but now inside their network to try and fool these nodes. So I guess 2 years later, is it so much of a problem? Is a lot of the content coming from on-net sources? I know a lot of this has changed. I guess I'm still asking the question: what's the relevance of the content to access relationship, and how does that how does that play out in this regional peering situation? I should probably have raised the microphone. I've just been bending down looking at the floor here. But.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to answer that question briefly, David. I mean, you know too much anyway. I think in Manchester's case, the big content is only just joining in. So I think we're still in pretty much a learning phase with that. It's going to be interesting to see what the advent of the Akamai Content Cache actually does there. So, and given that it's literally the last few days that's been connected, and I'm not sure it's even connected to the root server yet. We have yet to see.
I think it would just be interesting to get some feedback from those content operators who are sourcing the content at the exchange as opposed to putting their nodes inside the networks.
Yeah, good point. I mean, I think in general, the access networks don't want to come to the microphone and make public presentations about these things because they're probably saying some quite rude Anglo-Saxon words in private about things that have been done in the past. I suspect they probably won't particularly bless the content providers coming out and exposing some of that, but maybe some of that's inevitable, Dave.
Okay, thanks.
I think the openness of people, the willingness of big networks to make presentations, not just our own meetings, but also at UKNOF meetings, has been remarkable in recent times, and I think we need to keep encouraging those people and respecting, the presentations that they make.
Okay. Excuse me. Any other questions for John? Whoop. Okay, did you want to...
No, I'm done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.